Okay, so today we're going to cover section 7 of chapter 5. Today we're going to learn how to use congruent triangles. So whenever you want to prove two segments or two angles are congruent, after you've already proven that two triangles are congruent, then what we can do is add in one last step, and that last step is going to be stating that the two parts are congruent using the reason corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So when you put this in as a reason, this second statement here, you can use this acronym, CPCTC. And if you notice, every other letter is a C. And what the letters stand for is the first C stands for the C in corresponding. The P stands for the P in parts. The next C stands for the C in congruent. And then the T stands for the T in triangles. And then the last C stands for that last C in congruent. So what it stands for is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And the acronym is CPCTC. So what this means, or what they're stating here, is that when you have two triangles, and let's say I draw a triangle ABC here, and then a second triangle, and we'll label this one as DEF. And let's say you were given that angle C is congruent to F, and angle A congruent to D, and that side AC was congruent to DF. So if this is what you were given, and you had to write a proof, you would have listed all of this given, and then you could have made the statement that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, and the reason would have been angle side angle. Because if you notice, what we've got here is an angle, the side marked, and the angle on both triangles. So in order to use the CPCTC, you're first going to have to show that the triangles are congruent, and it would have been a proof like you've already written, whether you're bringing in reflexive side, whether everything was given to you, but you will try to figure out one of the 5 shortcuts that will prove the triangle's congruent. And then after you've done that, now we could go back, and let's say they asked us to prove that angle B was congruent to angle E. So now my next statement would be that angle B is congruent to angle E, and my reason would be CPCTC, because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And what this means is, if you thought about what we did at the very beginning of the chapter, in order to show that two polygons were congruent, remember, before we learned the shortcuts, we had to show that all 3 angles were congruent and all 3 sides were congruent. Then we learned the 5 shortcuts, and then we only had to look for 3 things. So if you think about it, once you found the 3 things, technically you can go back now and say every single angle and every single side that doesn't have a congruency mark is also congruent. And the reason is that corresponding parts, so any corresponding part is also congruent when you've got already proven congruent triangles. So this could have been the statement that they asked me to prove. I could have also been asked, so now I can add in a congruency mark on angle B and E. They could have also said, you know what? We want you to also prove that AB is congruent to DE. And again, we could use the same reason, Once the triangles are shown that they're congruent by whatever's given to you, then you can go back now and say everything else that doesn't have a congruency mark, like side AB and side DE, these are also congruent because they are corresponding parts of those congruent triangles. And then the last side that didn't have a mark would have been BC and EF. And again, same reason. So now I could have gone back and add congruency marks on every single piece of corresponding parts. So on the proofs that you're going to be doing in the homework, they're not going to ask you to do all 3 of these. It'll just be one of them. So you'll first have to show the triangles are congruent, and then they'll ask you to find one other piece of congruency that you can establish because the triangles are 2 congruent triangles, meaning they are exactly the same size and same shape. So let me go ahead and set up my statements and my reasons. Going to list all the given, and the given here was just PR bisects angle QPS, and that side PQ is congruent to PS. And I'm going to go ahead and label my picture. So PQ and PS are congruent. Now over here is my angle QPS. And remember, PR here is bisecting that angle. So then that tells me that it is now created 2 congruent smaller angles. Now, I can't just label the picture. I actually have to state the 2 congruent angles in my proof. So now that could be my second statement, showing what that angle bisector did, and it created angle QPR congruent to angle SPR. And that reason is definition of an angle bisector. Now, if you notice, what they're asking me to prove is that angle Q is congruent to angle S. All of the other proofs prior to this in this chapter, we were asked to prove 2 triangles are congruent. Now, I have to do that in this proof. I have to show that the 2 triangles are congruent, and then I can go back and show you how angle Q is congruent to angle S. Now, the 2 triangles that I'm going to show are congruent are this top one right here. I'm going to show that QPR is going to be congruent to triangle SPR. Now, so far, I've got 2 pieces of congruence. Now, I'm going to show that obvious, and that's going to be this reflexive side, and I can state that PR is congruent to PR. Now, you could have also stated the reflexive side as the second statement. So statements 2 and 3 could be reversed. It doesn't matter if you did the angle bisector first or the reflexive side first, but we need to get both of them in here. Now notice I've got 3 pieces of congruency on both the red triangle and the blue. And notice what's marked here is I've got a side, an angle, and a side on the red one, as well as the same side, the angle, and a side on the blue one. So this is going to be my reason for stating that triangle QPR is congruent to triangle SPR, and the reason is side angle side. So now I've shown that the red triangle is congruent to the blue triangle. Now I could go back and say any other corresponding part that are in both triangles are also congruent. And that's where the Q is congruent to S. And notice in the statement I wrote, you see how Q is the first letter and S is the first letter? So this tells me that angle Q is congruent to angle S, and my reason is because corresponding parts, because they're both the first letter in the statement, of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. Instead of writing out all of those words, just put the acronym. Now, in order to use this as a reason, you will first have to prove that the triangles are congruent. And you can use any one of the 5 shortcuts that we have learned. Now, my proof statement, it could have also been show also that QR is congruent to RS. So this is how I could change up the question. I could say instead of showing Q congruent to S, my proof statement could have been show that QR is congruent to SR. Or that last angle there, that angle PRQ is congruent to angle PRS. So this could also have been another proof statement, and the reason is the same, CPCTC. Because now that I've shown that the 2 triangles are congruent, that also tells me that all of these other corresponding parts are also congruent. So angle Q is congruent to S. And then this is the one that I just named with 3 letters, the QR, and again, PRQ, you could have also named it as QRP. The order of the letters in your congruency statement, it could have been changed. Like here, if you didn't want to do QPR congruent to SPR, you could have also named it as RPQ congruent to triangle RPS. Just make sure that everything had its corresponding part matching. This is where, when I give you the proof on the test, depending on, I have to read through everyone's logic, because again, everybody might have named the angles slightly different or the triangles different, depending on the order, if you reversed it and put it in the order I had, or if you wrote it backwards. Another example using this new reason, the CPCTC. So my next one, again, another proof. So statements and reasons. So again, notice they're not asking me to prove that the triangles are congruent. They're asking me to show that side RQ is congruent to RS. But what I'm going to do first is show that the triangles are congruent. And then my last step is going to be that CPCTC, that the corresponding parts of the triangle that I just proved are congruent are also congruent. So let's put number 1, state all this given, PR. Now this time, PR is bisecting 2 angles. So QPS, and it's also bisecting the other side, QRS. Notice this time they didn't give me any sides congruent. So this would have been given. So again, let me go ahead and label that. So my angle QPS is over here, and it's been bisected by PR. So that's creating 2 congruent angles. So I'm going to state that. So I can state that angle QPR is congruent to angle SPR. Now, I could put it in the same statement, or you could make it a separate statement. Notice it also told me that QRS was also bisected. So again, that's creating two congruent angle pairs. So again, I could state here that angle QRP is congruent to angle SRP. And now this reason is definition of an angle bisector. And now for my next statement, that side that they share, that reflexive side, I could state that PR is congruent to PR. You could also call it RP, doesn't matter. It's congruent to itself, and this is reflexive. And again, the two triangles I'm asked to show are congruent would be this top, let me do it in a different color, top purple triangle to the bottom blue one. And notice this time what's labeled is I've got an angle, the side, and then the angle. So it's the side that's in between the two angles in both triangles. So I can now state that the purple triangle is congruent to the blue triangle by using angle side angle. So QRP is congruent to triangle SRP, and the reason would be angle side angle. Now again, remember what we're asked to prove is that side RQ is congruent to RS. And now because I know that the purple and the blue are identical triangles, now I can go back and state that any other corresponding part is also congruent. And the corresponding part they wanted me to show was that RQ was congruent to RS, and that reason now is that new shortcut or reason, the acronym CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So now I can state that this side, QR, is congruent to RS. I could also have stated that PQ is congruent to PS because of CPCTC. Or I could have also said that angle Q is congruent to angle S. And again, that reason would have been the same, CPCTC. All right, so let's do the last proof. So statements and reasons. So number one, let's state all of this given, that WX is congruent to YZ and WZ or ZW is congruent to XY. So let me go ahead and add that in. So WX congruent to YZ and ZW congruent to XY. They want me to show that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Now, at first glance, you may say, oh, maybe they're alternate interior. However, we're not given that we have any parallel lines here. So I cannot show that angle 1 and 2 are congruent because they're alternate interior. Technically, they are, and we'll get there. However, we cannot use alternate interior within this proof unless we show that we do have parallel lines. Instead, what I'm going to do is show that the two triangles are congruent. And again, I got my obvious side here in the middle, that XZ, or you could call it ZX, is congruent to itself. So ZX, or if you named it XZ, either way is acceptable. And this is reflexive. And notice now the two triangles are going to be this red one here, shown is congruent to the blue one. And the reason why I can say that is because all three sides are marked. Side, side, side. So I can state that the two triangles XWZ, and again, the order doesn't matter as long as everything corresponds and matches, is going to be congruent to ZYX, and the reason is side, side, side. So now that I've already shown all three sides are congruent, now I can go back and say all the angles are congruent as well. But they only asked me to show 1 and 2, so that's my next statement, that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and that reason would be that the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are also congruent. The proof statement could have also been, show that angle W is congruent to angle Y. So instead of 1 and 2 being, you could also state that 3 and 4 are congruent, and these both have the same last reason, that the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Now, if the proof statement would have been, show that we had parallel lines, now that we've established that 1 and 2 are congruent, then we could use the alternate interior angle converse. So it may even take it a step further and ask you to prove parallel lines. And then that's when we would bring in those converses. So again, just take it step by step logically. And again, this lesson is all proofs. So again, for the 5-7 homework, all you're really doing is dragging and dropping the reasons into your proof or your plan for a proof. Now, if you want to practice writing proofs, handwrite them first. However, I'm not going to look for you to handwrite them. You can just drag and drop. So only turn in your screenshot of your score for 5-7, but you also have 5-4, 5-5, 5-6, and 5-7 warm-ups that you need to turn in for homework tonight, and that's also due tomorrow.